Hi everyone, my name is Cornelia Hernes, and I am very happy to be participating in this live stream on Proko.com. And it's great to be a participant launch of Proko, so I'm very happy to be partaking in this live stream. And so today I'm going to show or narrate a little bit this painting process right here. This is a portrait of Varvara, and I basically have kind of focused on three main stages, and I thought I can talk a little bit about some of the key concepts in these three stages. So starting off with the Blockin right here, I am using a monochromatic painting technique with a reduction as well. So what I did here was I just added the imprimatura, which is the stain that you see here on the canvas, which is a mixture of ultramarine violet and raw umber. So that created this really interesting kind of gray with a purple undertone. One of the elements I thought was kind of interesting with this mixture is that having a little bit more of the raw umber component in the mixture created a bit more of a warmer tonality, but also adding a kind of balance here with ultramarine violet, which is also quite transparent. It kind of swayed the mixture in a cooler direction without kind of turning blue. So I thought that for this particular portrait, starting in this way was interesting because Varvara has a lot of cooler temperature elements in her complexion, and I wanted to elevate those elements in this particular portrait of her. So this is a little bit of the first try I had with this particular color combination of raw umber and ultramarine violet for the wet imprimatura technique. But this is one of my favorite ways to start out the blocking process of a painting. Because it becomes a very organic, very fluid, a bit chaotic approach to the painting process. And as you can see, the focus now in the beginning is not really thinking about the lines so much, but rather focusing on the element of mass and value, and essentially extracting the light shape from the overall darker sort of mid-tone that is presented with the stain that is already here. So this is a really interesting technique, especially when you want to maintain a little bit of that kind of sense of I want to say controlled chaos in a sense, and you have maybe a composition that contains a lot of darker values or a shadow shape, then this is a really interesting approach. It's a little bit different than when building, for example, the foundation of a painting with first focusing on the shadow shape or first building it in a linear way. This is basically entering that sort of building process of the painting through the gate of value and mass, and first looking at the light shape as a sort of focus and translating the big impression of that light shape. And then once that is situated, one can then continue to build off from there, then looking more at the linear components of the structure. This is a highly organic, I think, approach to the painting process, and as you can see, it starts off in a very atmospheric way, and then of course one can solidify it, and it will become a little bit more sort of tighter and resolved. Some of this atmosphere that we now see will be, balanced a little bit more with more careful rendering. But if you are somebody who like to have a little bit of atmosphere, a bit of mystery sort of in your painting process, then I think this is a really interesting technique. Another benefit too is that you can use different tools to basically remove the wet paint from the canvas. For example, you can use Q-tips, that is very effective. You can use paper towel. Paper towel is maybe not the best because it can leave off a little bit of lint, especially if you do a lot of rubbing. So for this process, I used just a textile fabric so that I could kind of remove quite a lot of the paint without it sort of turning into lint on the canvas. What I'm painting on right here is it's actually a birch wood linen panel. So there is a linen canvas that is adhered to a birch wood panel. And sorry about the seagulls outside. I live by the coast, so you may hear the seagulls screeching in the background there. But what I'm doing right now is that I'm adding a little bit of the linear configuration, basically focusing on the element of structure, kind of extracting some key elements to the gesture and proportion. And so what we always have to think about in the Blockin process is how we can express the most with the least amount of information. So you notice now that there is no details, the mouth is not even hinted at, there is really no value modeling in the area of the forehead. The only thing that is there is basically the light value. And then I add a little bit of these sort of darker brushstrokes to show some indication of the forehead and the contour of the face and some indication of the eyes now. And then throughout this process, or this stage of the Blockin process, there's sort of a dance a little bit between adding information and removing information. So adding information and adjusting information. I think this is also an interesting aspect or key concept that is really helpful to keep an eye on, that when we select the information in the first moments of the painting process, it's helpful to, again, see how you can translate the most with the least amount of information, precisely so that one don't get caught up in too much detail too soon, because that would just kind of be in the way a little bit. But at the same time, we need to actually add information on the canvas in order to have something to work with. So there's an interesting balance point right there. So instead of thinking about eyelashes or nostrils or that kind of detail, because it doesn't matter right now, the main tool of observation that I use is squinting, because when we squint way down, we basically see a translation of values in a bit of a blurred view, and it helps to simplify nature and to simplify the element of mass. So it helps to kind of boil the structure down to the major components of dark values and light values. So that is essentially the major structural tools that is very helpful to build upon, whether one are working with a monochromatic underpainting, using a reductive technique like I'm doing here, or also if one are building from the kind of wireframe of the shadow shape and moving into the portrait in that way. So looking at the larger masses, what's dark, what's light, with a special attention to the shadow shape. And then I think here it's also interesting to mention the element of the dark transitional halftone, because I think sometimes it's sort of left a little bit in the shadows. It's ignored a little bit as a very important phenomenon. What sometimes happen is that in the pursuit of simplifying information, I see students that will only work with the shadow shape and the light shape, but then they will be a little bit disconnected. And very often that happens if the dark transitional halftone is not participating in the early moments of creating the foundation. So for example, in this portrait, we see a little bit of the value, darker value, that is existing on below the eye especially, but also the values that you see on the bridge of the nose. That's technically not shadow shape, that's dark halftone. But we can still see those values being apart from the light shape when we squint down, for example. And since those values are also situated in the area of the eyes and the nose, which is such essential areas to translate a sense of structure, we kind of need those values to translate the initial configuration of the gesture and proportion and the likeness. So instead of just thinking about shadow shape and light shape, I'd like to just propose the idea that we can juggle this sort of trinity between shadow shape, light shape, and the dark halftone. So the value that is kind of closer in value to the shadow shape than the light shape, but it's not shadow. Like that would be the dark transitional halftone. The value that you see is distinctly darker than the light shape, and that provides some sense of structure and visual translation. So I like to build with that as well when finding the initial translation of gesture and proportion and likeness. So that is hinting at some sense of form, like already around the nose now you can see that there is some sense of the volume that begin to emerge, the sense that the bridge of the nose is sort of protruding a little bit from the frontal plane of the portrait. And that has specifically to do with the combination of the shadow shape below the nose and the combination of these darker halftones that are on the bridges of the nose that are darker than the surrounding light shape. So that helps to convey some sense of rotation to those planes, thus conveying some illusion of volume, even at this very early moment of the painting process. So this is also one of the things that I love about this approach to the painting process, kind of working in a fairly monochromatic direction, although I started to add a little bit more color now, mainly in the area of the hair and in the shadow shape. There is a mixture there of umber, a bit of red, I believe I have there, in the shadow shape. So going really warm, kind of with the objective of later on keying those temperatures, those colors. So I have a cool background, a cool light shape, and then some really warm tones, very warm colors in the shadow shape and the light, and in the shadow shape and the hair. So that kind of sets the stage, the parameters of temperature as well as value, while there is still kind of room to expand both on the color and the value. So this is a really nice way of keeping things kind of simplified, but also slowly moving towards the destination of the color and the value and the structure, essentially, because that's what painting is all about, kind of finding a harmony between the translation of structure as pertains to gesture, proportion, and shapes, and of course a balance of values and colors as well. So there's a lot to juggle. But going about the blocking process in this way is just a really helpful way to simplify the early moments of the painting so that one can focus on establishing a really good sense of structure to the foundation, and then kind of build from there. But it is also possible to echo some element of the temperature and the color so that we don't have to abandon those components altogether in the pursuit of simplified information. One of my other favorite aspects of this sort of wet imprimatura painting technique is that one can scrape into the paint, and as you can see, we rubbed away a lot of the pigments in the area of the light shape. You can also use a barbecue skewer. This is also a really helpful tool. So you can almost draw a little bit into the wet paint using the barbecue skewer, which is especially helpful when working on sort of the delicate structure of the area of the eyes. All right, so I will continue to narrate a little bit during this live stream, but there is also some great questions that have trickled in here, so I'm going to make sure to also answer as many of these questions as possible intermittently and take a sip of water now and then. So I'm just going to take a couple of questions now. So I see Liz Gridley from Australia. Hi Cornelia, hope this is the right place to send questions. Yes, it is. I'm a figurative oil painter from Melbourne, Australia. I'm not academically atelier taught, but I have developed quite a slow process for my major works, like the ones attached, which by the way are really beautiful. Great job. Especially I like the one in the middle there of the guy, just because it has such a beautiful color shimmer, kind of like a pearlescence in the skin tints there. It's really beautiful. You mentioned, yeah, so you take about an average to 1 to 2 months to complete. So your question is, how do you manage your time when painting? Do you feel pressure to produce work fast for exhibition and sale, despite oils and realism being a considered and slow process? How do you manage the exterior time pressures? Yeah, that is a good question, and I completely feel that too, and would maybe like some advice on that myself. I think that we do live in a world that is very result oriented, and this also affects artists, where what we do is so process oriented, really is all about the process, and then the result is kind of like a byproduct almost of that process. Yet there may be the pressures of commission deadline or exhibition deadline, and then also the pressures that one maybe put upon oneself to be productive. And I guess one kind of have to navigate a bit within there, and I think some people work well under pressure. I actually do feel I tend to work okay under pressure, so I'm okay. I tend to procrastinate quite a bit as well, but I always manage to do the things I need to do within the time frame I set for myself. Whereas maybe other artists or other people prefer not to have time pressure. So I guess a element there is perhaps not to commit to too many projects if you do feel that you want to, or you thrive in a situation where you have a little bit more of an open-ended time element in a project. So I guess one just have to structure a little bit the exterior time pressures to fit one's own productivity and needs and preferences. But I do absolutely relate to this element of deadlines, and also I kind of put this upon myself in my own work. These days I'm focusing a lot of my time on making portrait painting tutorials, and I'm also branching into other genres that I release on my own Patreon page. And if you want to check that out, that is patreon.com/Cornelia Hernes Artwork. And there's a lot of content there, a lot of portrait painting tutorials, etc. And so I started this in 2018, I think it was. And so since then, I've been releasing a new tutorial every month. And that actually gets a bit hectic. And so, but I also enjoy it because it makes me be productive with the time that is sort of allotted. And my favorite time of the month is the painting process. And then there's a lot of video editing and a lot of extra of course, preparations that goes along with producing a tutorial from beginning to end to be released in 1 month bracket. So I absolutely feel you in terms of the time pressure, and I think what I did to kind of work within that format was to just work down and scale a little bit. So a lot of the paintings that I make, for example, like this one of Varvara, which is also one of the tutorials on my site, it is about 10 by 12 inches, so about 30 by 25, I think, something like that, centimeters. So working in a smaller scale has been a way for me to be able to make this like practical and to make this happen. And I like working in a smaller scale as well, so it's not at odds with what I naturally gravitate to anyway. Now, in terms of taking an average of 1 to 2 months complete, Liz, you certainly have a lot of rendering and a lot of refined detail in your work, which I think is great. And I would just encourage you to, not sacrifice on those elements. So if that is, characteristics, you obviously love working with form and with expression and with light and sort of with the drama of contrast, which is great. And your work is rich with a lot of variation and details. I would want to encourage you to keep that in your process as well, because that's something that you have an affinity for, and you seem to enjoy it, kind of based on what I can see here, a glimpse of your work. So I wouldn't sacrifice those elements. So I think this is where we as artists have to maybe push others to compromise a little bit on our process. So if you do have work that is highly rendered, and don't cut that out because you have to fill it a deadline. Do you know what I mean? So I don't think that one should change the element that one include in a painting just to pump it out faster. I don't think that would be. I think that could be harmful potentially for one's creative process. But what I will say is that through time, and certainly know that for myself, that through time one do become more effective and efficient at arriving at the same or similar destinations. I remember before I had any academic training, it took me months and months to even finish a small portrait, because I knew that it was wrong, or I knew that it needed to be resolved more. I didn't really know how to get there, so it was a lot of like weeny whiny road, a lot of circles, and then eventually I would get there. But I find that with time, with experience, and kind of with repetition, one become more effective without having to, sacrifice any of the quality of the work. And ultimately, that's not something that we should sacrifice. But working in a smaller scale, that can be a way, I guess. And also, depending on how you work, if you are searching for a lot of ideas or a lot of answers during your process, that can also prolong a little bit the layers. Whereas if you do a lot of sketches beforehand, color studies, that can actually effectivize the process forward as well. So if you're making a composition study that also contains some element of the color, for example, and the values and the solutions that you ultimately want to employ, that means then that there's a little bit less kind of invention during the painting process. So depending on how you work, that can certainly be a great way to find initial answers before getting into the larger project. So I think that's an investment of time, making sketches beforehand. All right, and so we have another question here, Herv801. Hey Hernes, I have trouble mastering brushstrokes and blending, especially in oils. What should I do? Yeah, if you need to practice, there's no easy way around it. When it comes to drawing and painting, there's a parallel here, I think, also to like music and even exercise, that I wish I could just read about exercising and then get fit, but that's not the way it works. But it is helpful to get some initial maybe theory, some initial guidance, so that one know how one can practice well. But then it really just boils down to repetition and repetition and repetition, and be kind of patient with yourself, but also be diligent and consistent as you are exercising any element of the painting process. So in this demo, there will be a bit of paint application as well. So you will see that right now there isn't really any modeling in the light shape, but that is something that will be addressed from the intermediate stage and also in the refining stage. So maybe you'll get some ideas in this demo. Another or other projects that I think is really helpful when just, for example, having this question, how to master the brushstrokes and how to blend brushstrokes in oils. You could, for example, set up fairly straightforward projects for yourself, like working on a sphere, just like ball. Maybe you could, I don't know, find a tennis ball or even an egg, that is also a sphere. It's a small shape, but something that has a round form, or even like a white porcelain bowl, something that has a round form that will give you the opportunity to work with the modeling of form. That can be really helpful, so that you have a project that is not as daunting perhaps as a portrait or a figure, but that is just catered to the study of form. And the reason why I'm suggesting this is that sometimes when we have to work with, for example, the portrait, there's already a lot of information there to juggle. And so just to simplify the task for yourself so that you can optimize the study, it can be helpful to set up something that may appear simple, but that is actually very targeted in terms of the element that you feel that you need to strengthen. So that would be my suggestion. So if you have like a bowl or a cup or a vase or a ball, like a sphere or something like that, set this up and then set it up preferably with one light source. So if you have light coming from one direction and a bit of shadow in another direction, so light and shadow. If I'm looking at myself, I have light from all the sides here, but I have mostly light here, a little bit of shadow here. Anyway, set it up so that you have, about 20% shadow, let's say. But one light source, this is important because that will give you a consistent and coherent shadow shape. And the shadow shape together with the light will give you room to investigate the transitional halftones. So if we look at the chin and the cheek and the jawline here of Barbara right now, you can see that there's dark right there, that's shadow, and then the shadow shape contour is right there, and that's immediately attached to the light shape, but quite right now, there isn't any transitional halftones that is turning that form, but that will be embedded in this portrait. And when that happens, great things happen in terms of that illusion of form and volume sort of coming out. So this all kind of ties together though, because the modeling of form also relates to being able to see a good contrast between dark and light so that you actually have values to model with. So that's kind of where I'm emphasizing this, so that it sort of starts a little bit in the setup perhaps. Maybe this was a major digression from your question. But in the mastering brushstrokes and blending, my advice there is to, again, set up a project that you can just explore and experiment and try out different things, essentially. One of the tools that I use for modeling the form is to paint wet in wet. And so I paint with overlapping brushstrokes when I'm modeling the form. And I haven't really gotten into that stage in this painting quite yet. Right now, I'm just scumbling a little bit, just rubbing a little bit of the pigments with a varying degree of opacity as a way to create a value variation. But when working more with opaque pigments, which we'll get into here, then working with a wet in wet paint application technique, that's how I model the form. And that's just a way of model the form. Another element that comes to my mind in terms of your question, Herv 801, is that in terms of working with oil paint, one of the elements that is so beautiful about oil paint is that its opening time is quite vast, so it takes at least a few hours to dry. And depending on the pigment and the color, it can take a couple of days to dry. So I tend to work with pigments that dry a little bit faster, like raw umber, for example, so that the paint will usually be dry the next day or the day after. But during the whole painting process, let's say if it's a 5-hour painting session or 8 even, I rarely experience that the paint dries. So the opening hour of oil paint, of course, is very different than acrylics. Acrylic dry really fast. And that makes it harder to actually work with fluid transition and wet in wet paint application because the paint freezes, and at that point it's not flexible anymore. So at least you're working in oils, and that's great. And I think that just working with a experimentation of brushes and paint strokes, you will be able to glean, I think, different experiences that you can build upon from there. So that's what I would advise you to do. And then I hope that maybe this tutorial will also shed some insight into how you can model the form as well. So stay tuned, because we'll be getting into that in not too long in this video. All right, so let me just shift my attention back into the demo right now. So the portrait is now at a stage that it has a combination of shadow shape and light shape, and there's some transitional halftones in the area surrounding the eyes. And now I also added some highlights in the eye and the nose. It's always very satisfying to add a bit of highlight because it can make the form kind of punch out a little bit or make the eyes sparkle. So even at this very early stage of the portrait process, there's a sense of life, I feel anyway, that is starting to appear in the area of the eyes because they're reflecting light. Sometimes I don't necessarily add the highlight this early on in the process. It sort of depends a little bit. Because when I add highlights, I tend to do that with a barbecue skewer. I dip into a bit of pure paint or pure white pigment, and then I tap it onto the painting. And that's how you can get a really nice crisp highlight going. Sometimes if we're not entirely sure what the drawing is, or if there is some structural questions in the area of the eyes, for example, it can be better just to hold off on adding the highlight because it is a glob of just white paint and it can potentially interfere if it is placed a little bit in not the ideal situation or ideal spot. So if I needed to change the location of those highlights, for example, I'd have to let the paint dry so one can paint over it. But if they have a bit of texture, that can always kind of create a little bit of textural interference later on. So I think when you do add highlight, add it when you feel that it can help to elevate an aspect of the drawing and strengthen the drawing, and perhaps not as you're still searching for the drawing. That would be my advice. So that you maintain a bit of flexibility, basically, with questions that may pertain to like where the position of the iris is. Don't add the highlight if you don't know where the iris is situated. But when you do know where it is situated, of course, bringing in the highlight can be a way to actually optimize the illusion of structure, and in this situation, how the eyes are kind of looking at us as well. So I focused quite a bit until this stage in the portrait on the eyes and the nose. So those features have been pushed quite ahead. The mouth is not there yet. One of the reasons for that is that the eyes, together with the nose, represent sort of the horizontal and vertical kind of cornerstones of the portrait. And working with the combination of the eyes and the nose is really helpful to ensure that one are capturing the same proportion and tilt. So even if I'm just tilting my head back and forth here, of course the nose is going to immediately respond to the tilt as much as the eye. So you have basically a T shape right here. So imagine that you have a T in perspective. If there is a gesture, if there's a change to the gesture, those relationships are going to change. But the connection between the nose and the eyes will always remain consistent. So therefore, working with the nose and the eyes sort of in unison, a little bit develop them together, is a really helpful way to just ensure that one are observing that connection correctly, and that one are not ending up with getting one eye too high up, or a tear duct that is like too far down in relationship to the other tear duct, etc. So when you work with something that is so sensitive to inaccuracies, making sure that you are developing it sort of in synergy is a really helpful way to go about it. And then the mouth can kind of just be positioned sort of within the rest of the portrait. So as long as in this situation, certainly, the contour of her portrait together with the contour of her shadow shape, as long as those proportions are in place, the mouth is going to find its correct position kind of within this framework. So that's kind of why I not always, but often will start the process in this way, kind of looking at the larger structures of the portrait first, interaction of shadow shape and light shape, and then really advancing the eyes and the nose together before introducing the area of the mouth. And in the area of the eyes, I do really like this stage, and in many ways I like the aesthetics of it as well. I have a hard time not continuing to work with a portrait. I always want to get into the element of color and texture, but there's some qualities to the eyes and the nose at this stage that I really enjoyed actually in this painting. I think also that interaction between the cool and warm temperatures, even at this very sort of simplified stage in the painting process, was something that I really enjoyed working with. And as you can see in the area of the eyes, there is a variation between the linear element of the, I want to say eyelashes, but I also want to be a little bit careful with that, because it's not eyelashes as in painting the individual eyelashes, but looking at the overall mass and the overall value of the eyelashes as a darker framework and a darker accent, in contrast to the eyelid that is catching a little bit of light. So there's this, I think, nice moment now in the painting where the eyes have this very interesting linear design, but it's also very atmospheric due to the values kind of below the eyelid and going into the temple here, out towards the temple, in this eye socket. That kind of connects together, and it's very soft. And so there's a sense of linear accents that kind of create a bit of punch, a bit of contrast, in harmony with sort of softer, more subtle transitions in the area of the eye socket. So that's an aspect I really enjoyed with this process, this painting process of Varvara here, and something that I was mindful to also maintain during the different stages of this portrait, and also when getting into the refining stage even if the painting changes quite a lot due to going into the element of color and much more of a value spectrum, also texture. This sense of atmosphere together with linear accent is something that was mindful to kind of carry through the different stages of this portrait as well. So just a couple of things in terms of the brushes. I use different types of brushes, and I cycle through a few of them. So very often I will have now it sort of changes, a hog hair bristle brush when adding paint initially. And then when working with a lot of this very delicate subtle detail and transitions, then I like to branch out into some sable hair brushes. And I work with brushes in a variation of scales because the different brushes will express sort of different phenomenon. So here I have a Raphael number 2 in my hand, and this is a sable hair brush. So as a Raphael is a brand, and they have different series. Forget the name of the series, but it is one of the sable hair brushes. And it's very small, so it will be a useless brush for the background or for when modeling a larger form. But when working with intricate shapes in the area surrounding the eyes, it's great because it gives a high degree of control. Meanwhile, working with a much larger brush in an area like that would be very clumsy. So working with smaller brushes when working with more intricate shape design in harmony with working with larger brushes when expressing larger forms, that tends to be a good, relationship, I think. Working with different brushes, different sizes, different hairs, because they sort of overlap each other in function. And so that enables you to express kind of more phenomenon, I think. So I don't think it's useful to only have hog hair bristle brushes or only have sable hair brushes, but having a bit of mix. At least that's how I enjoy working. Okay, so let's take another question here. It's from Tony. Hi Cornelia, I am currently learning digital painting from photo reference, and I'm finding that the more accuracy my art matches the reference, the less I enjoy looking at my own work. How do you balance accuracy with personal style? And do you have any tips for how to not end up becoming a human copy machine? Thanks. Okay, I'm going to take a glass of water for this one. A little clunk of water anyway. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a lot to unravel actually, because I do agree with the question that the purpose of working or when working from photographic reference, the purpose is not necessarily to copy everything verbatim. Because yes, that's not the point. We're not to be human copy machines anyway. So I think that this often becomes, and I will just speak in terms of analog mediums because I don't really work with digital painting, but I'm sure there's a whole lot of connection there in terms of working with digital painting or oil painting and using photographic reference. That there's a lot of commonality in terms of this question. So when one work from photographic reference, I think it is really helpful to, as much as possible, be mindful of that you can still make decisions. You can still decide to interpret how you're going to translate an edge, for example. Because one of the issues potentially with photographs is that it's going to oversimplify reality. Our eyes are actually still much more sophisticated as a way to observe nature or observe the world around us sort of visually. So the fact that we can look at the focal point and our eyes will kind of zone in on that, and the pupil will dilate, etc., and then we'll see something sharp, and then in our peripheral vision, which is quite broad, most of what's in the peripheral vision is quite soft. And so it's just really interesting, I think, how our eyes works as we look at information around us and how it is such a fine instrument. Much more sophisticated than a camera. And so I think if we start there, and kind of recognize that photography is another reference, is another tool that can be really helpful to work with, for sure. But if one gets stuck in this idea that the photography or the photograph cannot lie because it's made of a machine, so this is the truth, and then we have to copy it, and so a good drawing resembles a photograph, that is, I think, the moment that we can kind of get into trouble a little bit when working with photography. This idea that one have to copy everything the way that the photograph has it, because in the end, it's actually not necessarily going to translate the composition as your eyes would see something. There may be some different lenses and some different filters that will show a better depth of field, for example. But let's say a typical example is taking a picture of somebody in front of a landscape, and the photograph is going to render all those edges equally sharp. Whereas when you're actually standing there and looking at the scene, you will have a different, your eyes will observe the same information differently. It will look at the person in front of the landscape with a bit more focused point, sharper information. Maybe the landscape will have a bit of a softer contours. So I think acknowledging how our eyes see the world and use that as you are evaluating the information in the photograph. So you decide what you're going to translate and how you're going to translate it. And understand that you can make your decisions as well. So you don't have to create a sharp edge even if the photograph says that it's a sharp edge. You can create more texture even if there isn't any texture in the photograph. So along with that, it may be helpful to also set up projects. It's not always so, I know, easy to find somebody who is willing to pose if you're working with a portraiture. But I think setting up some kind of study, could be like a still life, could be a prop, just have some sense or some projects where you work from life, so that you get really accustomed to how your eye translates what you see and the decisions that you make sort of accordingly. Another thing I wanted to mention, Tony, is that looking at other people's artwork, let's see, I don't know, Sargent, Rembrandt, Caravaggio, whoever you find inspiring, or digital painters, to maybe make some studies of their work, because then you, and they may have painted from life, certainly, but interpreted life sort of visually. And so making master studies is really helpful as a way to extract or to kind of build upon the toolkit of translating nature, because then you will have a kind of further insight into how painters or artists from the past translated the very elements that you are translating, even if they may have painted or may not have painted from life directly. Some of them may have painted photographs as well. But so whether one are painting from photographs of life or from life, those kind of tools, those observation techniques and those decisions still apply. And it is certainly possible also to work from life and kind of get caught up in this idea that everything has to be sharp, because when we look at some things directly, it's going to be in focus in comparison to other elements that will be a little bit more blurred. So how you decide to look at something matters quite a bit in translating sort of the visual manifestation of structure. So when you look at something that is a little bit more in the periphery, like for example, Varvara's contour of her hair, which if we look at that picture and we kind of stare at some of those contours, we're going to find a whole lot more sharp information there than we have to translate. So, but if we kind of step back and we blur our eyes a little bit and we maybe look a little bit more indirectly at it, we will see it as a little softer. And that's actually how we can translate it. And that's a nice way of kind of balancing this element of sharpness versus softness. So I hope that helps, Tony. Yeah, personal style. How do you balance accuracy with personal style? Yeah, I can probably digress quite a bit into some of the questions within the question as well. Personal style. I haven't really done a lot of digital painting myself at all, but I use Procreate as a teaching tool for the sort of mentorship students that I teach through my Patreon page. And so through teaching privately or one-to-one, give one-to-one feedback on people's work, I started to explore Procreate as a tool. So I think it's really interesting, and I actually really do like Procreate a whole lot. I never went into painting thinking that I would explore digital sort of visual media, but I really enjoy it. And I also have started to on occasion brainstorm compositions sort of with Procreate as well. So that's really interesting as well. You can kind of brainstorm a lot of colors, a lot of shapes. You can brainstorm a lot of ideas in a very quick way using this digital tool. So that's an aspect I really like about it. Yeah, so about your own personal style, I guess what you can think about is that, yes, how to balance accuracy. Right, so accuracy really pertains to translating gesture and proportion, and maybe shadow shape and light shape. And beyond that, it can really be quite flexible. So I think that even painting, and I'm sure digital painting as well, is very forgiving. And this is the beauty, and I think also what makes it so exciting as a medium. Like, there's so many ways to translate the same composition. But the sense of structure is something that kind of always have to be there. So in translating Varvara's portrait from the photograph into painting here, I think about how I can keep a lot of these vivid brush strokes and really, embrace the medium of paint while I'm also using or working from photographic reference. But what I'm not kind of budging on so much is the structure. So how the eyes are aligned with the nose and how the features kind of work within the light shape. So those are the structural elements that I think always have to kind of, they always, we can't budge from that. That's if the nose is off to the side, we are all going to notice it. So I think work, that is the most important aspect of accuracy. I would even say, although proportions are important, the sense of like physical symmetry matters even more, because at the end of the day, when we experience the artwork, if the cheeks are a little bit wider or etc., it doesn't matter so much unless it is a portrait of someone in specific. But if the eyes are askew or the mouth is kind of off to the side, that is going to be noticeable regardless. So I think that those kinds of things, the structural element, we're looking at, how everything kind of connects, in the sort of anatomical framework, that's really important. And then the sense of texture, brushwork, color, that's really where we can dive into, I think, a lot of, personal style, or a lot of sort of visual exploration. I hope that helps. Okay, so I'm going to take a glance at the painting now for a moment. Take a little sip of water as well. So right now, what I'm doing now is I'm actually not rekeying quite, but I'm rebuilding the dark halftones in the area of the cheek and the jawline, and that connects to the chin. So this, I think, is an interesting moment to point out, because we have a little bit of a ugly duckling stage occurring where there is a kind of wacky connection. It's not a connection, it's kind of between those halftones and the light shape right now. So what I decided to do was just to kind of go through this process to optimize the darkest transitional halftones. So I darkened the shadow shape, kept the light shape, but through darkening the shadow shape, I found that I had room to go darker with some of these darkest transitional halftones. So while there was a lot of form there that was working, I also felt during this process I could kind of take another wash over this area and optimize the transitions in that zone, and kind of rebuilding that area. So almost like adding another bridge, adding another structure, adding another blanket of information on this area. So by darkening the darkest transitional halftone, you notice that there's a stronger contrast then between the darkest transitional halftone that is collaborating with the edge of the shadow. And through that becoming darker, there's a stronger sense of volume that starts to emerge. Now, as I am darkening this dark transitional halftone, I'm also creating a kind of facetation into the light. So notice now that this painting process started kind of right in the shadow shape. Actually, it started with the shadow shape, getting darker there, and then going darker, really, really dark with the darkest transitional halftone, and then carrying that a little bit into the light, and then painting into that, and carrying that into the light. So Herv 801, notice now, in terms of the modeling there, it's a little bit of a chaos that is occurring, but it is painting wet and wet, painting with overlapping brushstrokes, painting into kind of preceding values. It's not rubbing it around. It's very conscientious. It's working with a specific color at a specific location and value. But it is also a little bit of fluid, a little bit of ebb and flow is how I would like to say it. So going a little bit darker than maybe the goal, over into the mid-tone, and then painting a little bit of the light back into that half-tone, kind of weaving those transitions together, so that the result of what you see in that transitional area is not haphazard. It's very structured, but it is actually painted with a lot of fluidity. So I like to say sometimes that when we paint in oil, we have to embrace the chaos. And kind of through embracing the chaos of oil paint, we can get a little bit of control to it. So understanding that while we need to develop a sense of control, there's also a lot of kind of forgiving element to the oil paint. So in the darker halftone that we see right by the jawline, for example, that can go a little darker or a little lighter depending on what's kind of added to it. And the color that we see right below her cheek, or her eye right there in the cheek area, there's a little bit of a rosier mixture there, and that transition also moves. There's a lot of activity there for sure. A lot of value variation, a lot of color variation, a lot of shape variation, and also a variation between the larger planes and the smaller shapes within those larger planes. This is what makes modeling the form, I think, especially complex also, because it is an area that calls for a lot of structure, yet it also requires a lot of fluidity in order for that form to read convincingly. So again, kind of working with a overlapping brush technique, going a little darker into the light and then weaving a bit of the light into the dark, not mushing it around. It's still kind of working with very specific brush strokes along the way. I'd also like you to notice that relative to the modeling technique happening right now, that there's quite small brushes that are employed with relatively short brush strokes as well. Because when working with the area there, it's packed with so much variation. The darker halftone that you see right there is distinctly different than the darker halftone that you see up there, which is lighter. So what we have is a bridge that is very active. A lot of information there. So if we had painted such an area with just really large brush strokes, that could work as a block-in stage. But at this stage, where the objective is to branch out into a lot of subtle variation, a large brush would just eat up like all the neons that needs to be embedded in that zone. So working with fairly small brushes actually to vocalize the intricacy of the planes that exist in that area, and working with short brush strokes for the same reason as well. When we work with long brush strokes, that can be great for the beginning if you need to kind of fill an area with paint kind of quickly. Working with larger brushstrokes is an effective way to do that. But when we get into the modeling element or modeling stage of the painting, having those long brush strokes, as if you're like painting the wall, that's going to really create a generalized translation of form. So maybe it can work when working with fabric or something that flows, but maybe not so much when working with the planes of the portrait, which is richly faceted. And I want to mention something about that as well. That the reason why we see a variation of value is precisely because there is an interaction between light and form. So when we have a form that receives some amount of light, that's going to reflect that light. So we'll have a certain percentage of light. So on Varvara, we see, of course, quite a lot of light in the forehead and right below her eye. And then we see an absence of light in the shadow shape. The shadow shapes will not have any direct light. The shadow will have maybe ambient light or reflected light. So the light will be secondary. It will first bounce off another plane before it travels into the shadow shape. That's what that means. But the dark transitional halftones that we see around here, they receive some amount of light, but it's a lot less than the values that we see, in the forehead or the cheek that receives a lot more light. So just to kind of synopsize here, values are a direct response to the planes shifting direction in relationship to the light. And so this is why when working with halftones, we are working with kind of the fall of light in a way. And so including these halftones are an essential component to illustrating this illusion of volume and dimension, which is of course a big part of translating nature visually. So if we just take a moment I can't glance back now, but if we recall at the beginning of this Blockin stage, the focus was on the shadow and the light. So there was some amount of contrast there, but there wasn't any amount of volume, not in the same way as we now have. And that is precisely because of what the transitional halftones kind of add to the table, because those transitional halftones communicate the various directions of the planes relative to the light. This also ties into the element of structure, because values, those transitional halftones, directly connects to the kind of anatomy of planes. And so as much as possible when we are working with those types of areas, we must also search for the specific shapes that we see kind of transitioning, from the jawline into the light shape, because there is sort of these anatomical structures along the way that create specific shape designs. Again, this is why I think working with modeling of the form is especially advanced and especially tricky in any kind of painting. But I think also especially enriching and enjoyable. It's kind of my favorite part of the painting process, because it's sort of the moment when we get a lot of the form and volume and three-dimensionality appearing. So in my brush in my hand right now, I have a Blick Studio Bristle number 2. And it's a brush that kind of it lost its shape really quickly, or soon after I started to use it, and therefore sometimes it's actually really nice to work with when modeling the form, because it doesn't have a will to shape the brush stroke in a specific way. It has this sort of very unstructured shape, and so sometimes it works really nicely when modeling the form. And when working on a small brush like this, I'm almost thinking about it as a little bit as a drawing tool that I can kind of cross-hatch with it a bit. And I think there's an interesting parallel here also between drawing and painting. When building values in the context of drawing, it can often be very helpful to work with cross-hatching, so working with lines that move in different directions as a way to convey the articulation of these shapes that we see, the planes, and also seeing how everything kind of connects together, how you have a lot of smaller shapes within a larger form, for example. So working with crosshatching is a really effective tool to convey that sort of form phenomenon. And there's a strong connection there to kind of cross-hatching with the element of line, to kind of cross-hatching with the brushstroke essentially. So moving in different directions as I'm exploring the form here, precisely to convey how the values and the shapes kind of flow in all kinds of directions. So I kind of move a little bit in the direction that is convenient to create a specific shape that I am seeing. And those shapes will usually kind of crisscross each other in several different directions as well. So, so that I think is something I'd like you to take note of as sort of moving forward in this demo as well. That the direction of the brush or my hand, it will move in different directions in response to the shape or to the structure that is sort of observed in a specific area. Okay, so let's have a glance at some of these questions, and there's a few more added to the mix as well. So let me see if I can cover some of these. I'm going to do a bit of scrolling here. Okay, let's see. Okay, so Peter Lenning says, hello Cornelia, could you elaborate on how to achieve likeness, find proportion and create the illusion of volume when attempting to paint a portrait? Thank you. Thank you for your question, Peter. So the illusion of volume, I think that we kind of touched on that right now, working with the transitional halftones as a way to convey form and volume. That's basically that question. But I want to also rewind a little bit and synopsize, because working with those transitional halftones, I also want to mention that they are also really sensitive to the key of the values. So before elaborating a whole lot on these transitional halftones, first make sure that you have targeted your darkest dark, and usually that would be the shadow shape. It could maybe be a dark value somewhere, or dark hair, or maybe a dark background. But create a note of your darkest dark and your lightest light. So what's the value of your light shape? So that you have those parameters in place, so that you can build a bridge kind of rich with variation in those dark transitional halftones. Values are so relative, so without knowing the destination of the shadow shape, it would be really tricky to key correctly the transitional halftones. So light shape, shadow shape, that needs to be established first, and then work with those transitions. And just to kind of use this as an example, then I did end up rekeying a bit, so going a little bit darker with that shadow shape, and through that having a domino effect of then having to go into kind of remodeling the transitions right there, sort of in response to going darker with the shadow shape. And that certainly can be something that we can use as a part of the process as well. So if you do prefer to layer your painting, you can key it more gradually if you want to, or if you enjoy a bit of alla prima approach, a more direct approach to your painting process, then keying early on becomes important, so that you can use that contrast to help navigate your transitional halftones by. Okay, so how to achieve likeness and find proportion and create, So starting with the proportion there, when working with the portrait, the element of likeness can sometimes sort of start to emerge fairly early on, even before one have gone into the element of detail. And that can be translated when one are looking at the composition and you're blurring your eye, squinting again, and you kind of just see everything a little bit in a squinting impression. It becomes blurred and without detail. And already at that stage, you can start to echo the likeness of somebody. So it's not that one have to get into the individual eyelashes or that type of detail before likeness happens. Likeness can actually happen pretty early on, when the relationships of the larger masses within the variation of dark and light is sort of clicking together think about them as sort of puzzle pieces that kind of have to match a little bit. So I would think about some component of the likeness kind of from the early moments as pertains to gesture, proportion, shadow shape, light shape. And then of course we're not building upon the likeness and the expression as well as we move forward in the painting process. So the element of proportion, there's many kind of approaches there, but I tend to work with a side-sized approach, and that means that I will set up the composition. So if I'm working from live or from photographic reference, I will try to set it up so that I have a translation of the scale that I'm seeing something at. So there will be a 1-to-1 scale translation rather than just comparative, where you would be looking at how many distances of the forehead exist in the portrait or in the length of a figure. But I also want to say here that side size is a bit like a comparative method, but it is kind of working within the same scale, and that can sometimes make comparisons a little bit easier as well. So that's the first thing I want to mention there, but it's just like one aspect of finding the proportions. Then finding the proportions, I tend to start off with finding the top of the head and the chin, because that establishes the scale of the portrait. And once that is locked in, I will then start to indicate the nose in the situation. But pretty much in all portraits I work with, I will have some indication of the nose. And then in terms of establishing the early configuration of the proportions of the eyes, I think it's helpful to indicate not just an arbitrary line in the middle of the eye, but rather the eyebrow and the bottom side of the eyelid, or the lower eyelid. So thinking about the proportion of the eyes as the eyebrow on the lower eyelid. So then you have like 1 and 2 and like 3 and 4 major proportions situated. And one of the ways that you can translate it then is working with the comparative methods, kind of finding like how many distances do you have, like between the forehead, or how many noses do you have, between such and such distance. Or you can set it up in side size so that you can make direct comparisons, and that becomes a really helpful way. In addition, there are other observation techniques, like for example, looking at the connection between the shadow shape and the light shape. So already from the earliest moment of the block-in of this portrait, before going into any element of the fine transitions or the details, there was already some kind of framework of the larger structures indicated. And indeed, that was the element to focus on. So I think when you are working with the block-in, consider how you can not include detail early on, but rather what you include it as correctly as possible. And for example, work with comparative techniques as a way to use kind of mechanical techniques to translate proportion, or use side size. I also want to mention the importance of just kind of squinting down and looking at the shape configuration abstractly. And you can also use a mirror for this. So if you have a mirror that you look into upside down or sideways, that's a really powerful observation tool to make sure that those shapes that you are translating are translated well. And what can sometimes happen is that as we look at something in one way over a duration of time, we can kind of get a little bit blinded by it. So precisely therefore, refreshing our vision by looking into the mirror. I'm holding my hand up right here, but imagine that this is a mirror. I don't have one within reach. But if this is a mirror surface right here, I look into it. I have my phone, I don't know. So I look into it like this, or I would look into it like that, for example. And it's just a way of abstracting what we see. And this is a great tool. So if you're looking at shadow shape and you're abstracting it in a mirror, or you're looking at the light shape and you ask yourself, what is the shape of the light shape? How does the forehead relate to the distance that you see in other areas, for example? What is the shape configuration there? That also is a very powerful tool to catch any inconsistencies in terms of the proportion. That in turn will be the kind of groundwork for the likeness. Okay, so probably there is more to elaborate on there, Tony, but I think that's the most important aspect that came to my mind. So Yeah. Oh, I have a lot more questions and time. Okay, so we have a little bit less than an hour remaining. This is a lot of fun, by the way. So I wanted to thank Proko again for inviting me to this gig in the event of the launch of the 2.0 Proko. And so let's see now. I want to make sure that I also cover some more questions, and I tend to be very thorough, as I'm sure you guys noticed. So I can probably go through some of these questions maybe a little bit faster as well. But you know what? Let me shift direction for a moment and also now mention that we are soon, I think, or if we're not already kind of in the intermediate stage, or maybe you're already on the refining stage of this portrait. So I tend to kind of define this a little bit loosely. So, for example, the 3 stages of a painting process. We have the Blockin stage, that will also kind of go into the underpainting stage a bit. Finding the structure is really the essence of the early moments of the portrait. And then in the intermediate stage, what I think about with the intermediate stage is the stage where the initial configuration is in place, but a lot of the massing in and the modeling of form has to happen. And then that kind of goes through the different emotion, and then kind of gradually we move towards the refining stage. And I like to categorize the refining stage as the stage where everything is pretty much set, but one can work with very subtle information. For example, adjust an edge or a transition or a shape. This is also a great stage to consider this element of likeness, for sure. Because as we're working with the element of the eyes, for example, we also get into the element of expression. So considering, for example, the inclination of the eyebrow, is it like furrowed? Is it surprised? Is it like, sleepy? So like all of that, our expressions will kind of tend to manifest themselves in the eyes, and I think also in the area of the eyebrows. So being especially sensitive to the inclinations of the shapes surrounding in that area is a sure way to help to translate the element of the likeness as well, and certainly the expression also. So when getting into this stage, sort of intermediate and towards the refining stage of the portrait, I think also using our intuition is a really helpful tool. Using our intuition, I think, is something that we can use at all stages of the painting process. Meaning, like, if something doesn't feel right or if something is a little bit annoying, address it. And you can kind of let the sort of intellect and the analysis sort of collaborate with the intuition. And so when we get into this element of working with the sensitivity of the expression, kind of bringing soul and personality into the portrait, I think allowing our intuition to participate in that process is really helpful. And you can, for example, ask questions to your intuition, like, what do I feel in this expression? Like, if I'm feeling what she is feeling, what am I feeling? Is it the same in my painting as in the composition or as in the model that I'm working with? Oh yeah, so now it's kind of the refining stage, kind of getting into that a bit. And so if you feel that, no, my portrait is a little angrier, or my portrait is a little sleepier, or my portrait is smiling more, well, then let's take those kind of responses, those very intuitive, emotional responses, kind of into our mind, where we can kind of engage with what the reasons may be. Is it because the inclination of the eyebrows are a little bit different? Is it because they are furrowed? Is it because the corners of the mouth are pulled down rather than up? So we can absolutely sort of engage both with our intuition and our intellect and allow them to collaborate. And this, I think, is especially a helpful sort of approach when refining and also working with the element of likeness, but also expression. So I want to mention now, going into the refining stage of this painting, that everything is sort of locked in place. Like, the big questions are answered and largely resolved. The modeling of the form is pretty much locked in. And now is the time to really fine-tune this element of the expression and the shapes in the area of the eyes. So with the eyes now, I did decide to go in here and kind of take another little, let's say, another wash of values. So you will see in the remaining of this demo that some of the transitions in the area of the eyes will also become a little darker. You'll also notice that there will be a little bit stronger sense of atmosphere in the area of the eyes. And that will happen because some of those values will become darker, but some of the connections will also become a little bit softer. But before going into the softening element, what we can consider when we are reworking or repainting or fine-tuning an area is that we can first create a statement of the shape and the color and the value. And that's what I'm doing right now in the area of the eyes. I'm kind of going back and forth a bit, looking at how they relate together and kind of building upon the, refining the area of the eyes, kind of going back and forth each eye so that one eye doesn't get overly refined while the other one is kind of lingering behind. So there is some sense of connection between the level of development of the eyes at all stages. This is a really helpful way to make sure that when I'm not developing one eye kind of out of context to the other eye, but really making sure that they work together. And so now it's starting to look a little bit crazy because I'm going in there with these really dark values, and the brushstroke is pretty sharp. But here is kind of the breakdown. In the pursuit of refining this area, I decided to repaint the modeling of the form of some of the transitions surrounding the eyes. So in that endeavor, I first create a statement. So first looking at the overall shape and the value that I want it to be and the color that I want it to be. So having the color and the value and then going in there and just targeting that shape. Never mind that it looks disconnected from the surrounding values just yet. That will be the next sort of step in this kind of reworking process. So once we have targeted the darkest nodes, because the lightest areas are already here, remember the light shape is already where it needs to be. So now it's just kind of fine-tuning some of these darker transitions. So in that endeavor is seeing how dark can I go in the darkest areas. And then now I'm creating a little bit of a facetation. So in the area of the eyes, I just have like the darker value, and then I painted a slightly lighter value, bridging that darker note to the lighter area, and then again creating another bridge, And as these kind of pixelated translation of these planes now start to click in, and now start to drag a little bit of the paint across the surface so that it is not left kind of in this blocky way, but that there is an integration of those brushstrokes. At this stage, it can be, we can use a couple of different techniques. We can paint with overlapping brushstrokes, which I'm doing right here. But we can also use a little bit of softening tools. Sometimes I like to use a dry sable hair brush just to drag a bit of the wet paint kind of across the surface of the painting. So that I'm not moving the whole kind of glob of paint, but just like whisking a little bit of the wet paint across into the kind of neighborhood area. And that's a really nice way of maintaining the structure of a given area while also optimizing that kind of fluidity of the form. And remember, in the Blockin process and the underpainting process of this portrait, I talked about that I enjoy this sort of softness of some of the transitions surrounding those eyes, and I wanted to maintain that. So that's very much kind of in at the back of my mind, or in the forefront of my mind maybe, in this repainting process or refining process of the eyes as well. So it looked initially choppy, but then we can refine and kind of reintegrate those brush strokes so that they have kind of a liquid connection to their neighboring brushwork. All right, so working with small sable hair brushes right here, working with a kind of variation of directions to express the multitude of shapes and directions to the planes, essentially. Yeah. let me redirect now and see if I can cover a few more questions and drink some water as well. Okay, so Lijuan, McQuillan, Lijuan, McQuillan. Okay, my painting seems to go darker after a while of finishing the painting. How do I keep the color look fresh and vivid? If your painting starts to darken after time, it could be an aspect of your linseed oil, maybe. It could be the linseed oil or the oil that you use, or it could be that you are letting your paints dry in the dark. Sometimes that can actually add to the darkening process of an oil painting. So if you're using a medium like linseed oil, make sure that you get an artist grade and you don't get a linseed oil, from like from a hardware store, because linseed oil from like a hardware store, like used for furniture, etc., is not going to be kind of cleaned in the proper way, and so that linseed oil is going to contain a lot of pollutants that is going to make it oil or make it yellow and darken more over time. So make sure that you use a artist grade linseed oil. That's the first thing that comes to my mind there. Now, another aspect is that linseed oil, even an artist grade linseed oil, can over time darken and become yellow, especially if you store your artwork in the dark. So if that's the case, my advice is to bring your artwork out into the light, because oil paintings, they actually enjoy a lot of light, but indirect light. And so if you have an issue of your painting darkening or becoming yellow, that would be my question. And it's quite amazing what an effect this can have. I remember a student once had painted some casts, and there was a lot of lighter areas kind of on the cast naturally, and she had used a lot of oil, I think, and layered it quite a bit in many painting sessions, done a lot of oiling out. So there was probably a lot of linseed oil built up in her painting already. And then she tucked it away, and I think into like a cabinet to let it dry there, which is a good idea to kind of prevent any dust from gathering on the painting. But it can be a bad idea in terms of the darkening of the painting. So she showed some of her work to me, and it was like really yellow. It looked like somebody had poured I don't know, just like it looked like a yellow color that was kind of glazed almost on some of the cast paintings. But after keeping the painting out in the light, after just 3 weeks, it actually just kind of brought back the value and the color sort of the original application. So in essence, the sort of sunlight kind of bleached a little bit the linseed oil, not the pigment. And so that brought back the color and the value to it. So my question is for you then, Li Yuan, if you are using a good artist grade oil or medium, and the second question is if you are using maybe a lot of it, so consider maybe reducing, like if you're oiling out, let's say, consider reducing the amount of oiling out you do in between sessions. That would be another thing. And then the third thing is, are you keeping your painting in the dark when you are letting it dry? So if so, then bring them out into the light, and you may very well see, even within a fairly short amount of time, that you will get some of the light coming back. And I assume this is oil paint, but maybe it is acrylic. If it's acrylic, I don't know. But if it's oil paint, usually it sort of sinks in and it becomes matte over time, and it becomes too light actually, or lighter than it actually is. But that's another aspect of the oil paint. But that's not your question here. So yeah, how to keep the color look fresh and vivid. Yeah, I will say though that if it is oil paint and if none of the things I just said applies, it could very well be an aspect of that it looks a little bit matte and dull if it is drying. Sometimes that can be the case with sinking in, but usually the darker values appear lighter when the oil paint is sinking in. But the colors also get a little bit more muted until you eventually varnish your painting. So if that's the situation here, then I think kind of bringing back the kind of color and the value and the kind of chromatic intensity, then eventually varnishing your painting is going to bring back to life those elements as well. So that would be my other question for you. Okay, Adela Creative asks, hello Cornelia. Hello Adela. I paint from my home studio and keeping it non-toxic is vital to me. I got you. I am using linseed oil for glazing, but I found that the pigment doesn't adhere well to the canvas. I've also tried non-toxic gel mediums, but it takes forever to dry. Do you have any advice on mediums for glazing that are non-toxic? Yeah, so I completely hear you there, and I think I'm glad to hear that you're not using turpentine. I think, by the way, turpentine is usually overly used. Also want to mention here that for this painting process, did not use turpentine, just use a little bit of linseed oil, that's it. So linseed oil, of course, is something that we can, it's a non-toxic oil. Walnut oil also is non-toxic. But I'm wondering, Adela, is if you may be overly diluting your pigment when you are glazing. If you find that the pigment does not adhere well to the canvas, I have some kind of counter questions there for you, because I wonder, is it something that you notice when you are just applying the glazing? Is it pebbling that is happening, like the oil is kind of being rejected from the ground below? Or is it something that happens after the paint has dried and you kind of scrape it and it's not adhered well? Those are some questions. I'd almost want to know more in order to kind of find the best answer I know for you. But yeah, I think that you are kind of bringing up an aspect of glazing, which I also wanted to elaborate on a little bit. I think linseed oil for glazing, or alternatively walnut oil for glazing, should be good. There might be more complex glazing mediums concoctions out there. I tend to be pretty simple when it comes to the oils and the mediums that I use. So I usually stick to walnut oil or linseed oil. I like walnut oil sometimes because it has a little bit more of a thinner, sort of less thick and sticky texture, and it's also a paler color. And sometimes, depending on the brand, walnut oil can dry even slower. But the walnut oil I use is Mr. Graham walnut oil. I suspect they use some sort of cicative in the oil because it does dry really kind of quickly, quicker than you would think, because walnut oil is a little bit more slow drying than linseed oil. Maybe they have some alkyd in it or something, I'm not sure, but I do like it a lot. I like the behavior of it. But so I think that in terms of the oil that you're using, Adela, linseed oil should be fine. If you want to use walnut oil, that should be fine as well. What glazing is basically adding a transparent pigment on top of some foundation, typically. But glazing does not only have to be that. We can also use essentially like a glazing process during the repainting process of something. So if you are working in an area and you find out, now I need to tint it a little bit cooler, or this zone needs to become a little bit warmer, or I want to create a bit of a different color story in a different area in the painting, then you can essentially take a transparent color pigment and spread it very thinly over that area, and that's glazing. Usually glazing technique will kind of coincide with direct painting processes as well. So glazing is not a solution if your colors and your values are off. You know, you still need to train those aspects of color and value observation in your painting process. Well, glazing can be a great sort of addition to, I think, a direct painting process, where, for example, you create a foundation and then maybe you add more color, more luster, or more you know, a specific unity or unify kind of the color with, for example, glazing. Sometimes what I will do is that I will oil out in an area that has sunken in. And if I find that I need to shift the color a little bit in one direction, maybe I'll add a little bit of a pigment to that oiling out process. And that's essentially glazing. And then I will paint into that very often, not always. We can also use glazing as a way to create a more of an intensified chroma in a certain area. So when working with, for example, very colorful metals like copper that has a strong sheen but also a lot of chroma and color, then sometimes it's tricky to get both the value and the color. In that kind of situation, it can be helpful to build the lighter values first, let it dry, and then kind of glaze on top with, let's say, transparent yellows or oranges and reds to kind of optimize the sense of color and value. That being said, I will say that for this painting, most of my paintings, I don't do a lot of glazing. I do more direct painting. But I do think that knowing a little bit about glazing is helpful. But I have also, not mentioning you now, Adela, but I have come across a lot of questions about glazing recently. I feel like it's in the wind right now. There's a lot of questions of glazing out there. And I think that it's one of those things that can maybe be a bit confusing because it's a bit mystical, like what's glazing, what's the glazing medium, recipe. It can be really simple, actually. Glazing basically is a thin layer of a transparent pigment over something that has already, a foundation that has already been established. And it's a really interesting way to create a color intensity or change the color story of an area. But it doesn't have to be something that you must include in your painting. It's not a must-have. You can conclude your painting with direct painting. But if you want to optimize some sense of the color in an area, color intensity, then going in with a bit of glaze work can be helpful. But again, you can just use some linseed oil for that. I think I digressed quite a bit from your question, Adele. I'm sorry about that. But I suspect that you may use a little bit too much oil. So think about just using less oil. I wonder if what can sometimes happen is if we're not putting a lot of oil on the canvas, is that you basically kind of get a little swimming pool of oil, and then the pigments is going to kind of be suspended in that, but it's kind of going to glide around a little bit in the oil. So try instead to make sure that your painting is completely dry, and then use a little bit less oil and rely a little bit more on kind of vigor, just to kind of pull the particles of the pigments, kind of spread them evenly across the canvas or across your painting. Of course, a little bit of oil can be helpful, but I would try to reduce the oil because I suspect that might be an issue. Yeah, so give it a try and see what happens there. Cool. I'll move on to the next question here. Kenneth Mark says, "Hi Cornelia." Hello, Kenneth. Aside from practice and observation, what was the biggest influence on your ability to render light? Was there a particular artist or instructor or book? Yeah, it's I think it's one of those things that may kind of have, that is kind of in the subconscious somewhere, so I kind of have to go back in my mind to see if I have the answer there. I don't know if I have a sort of a specific epiphany, but I will say that one of my sort of major kind of milestone moments in terms of even understanding that oil paint was something that is possible to do today was when I was about 16. I went to it was like a high school trip to a exhibition in Oslo, Norway, and in this exhibition place, it was the first time I saw a painting by Odd Nerdrum, and that blew my mind, and it left me stunned, and it kind of became a paradigm shift, I think, in my comprehension that painting like this today was humanly possible. And that was a painting that was very strong in terms of dark and light. There was two figures sort of in this fantasy landscape a little bit, or this, kind of stark landscape. So where the figures were very light and then the background was very dark. So that was a huge influence, I think, on me and my path to wanting to become an artist or painter early on. So I would almost want to say Odd Nerdrum as the artist that stands out in terms of biggest influence to ability to render light, or like seeing light, or kind of comprehending what light is, or the interaction between shadow and light. And a lot of Odd Nerdrum's earlier works certainly was very kind of based on chiaroscuro. They were initially, he was inspired, I think, for a while there by Caravaggio. So there was like, strong definition between shadow and light. Yeah, speaking of which, Caravaggio, I think also, he's also one of my sort of early heroes. Still is, certainly. But I think that Caravaggio is a really good one to look at in terms of looking at what can be done with the shadow shape and the light shape, and seeing what that does in terms of both structure but also light effect and the rendering of volume. And then, of course, I did go to the Florence Academy of Art as a student, and then later on I was hired on as a principal instructor there for a while before going into online teaching now. So yeah, during my sort of academic studies at the Florence Academy of Art, there was so much of the foundation of that philosophy is based on light, and keying the shadow shape and the light shape as a way to obtain light effect, and then work with the organization of transitional halftones in between. So that, of course, is a big part of kind of my practice and my training as well. It's interesting, though, that one don't necessarily always have to have a chiaroscuro type composition in order to see light, or to have translate the effect of light in the painting. It is definitely possible to have a strong light effect also in a painting that is keyed kind of light. I'm kind of thinking a little bit about Hammershøi comes to mind a little bit. A Danish painter, turn of the century, painted a lot of interior, a lot of light kind of touching on planes in a room. And some of the paintings will have a bit of glow as well, where there's definition between the shadow and the light, but then the light kind of is almost like these photon light particles that travels off a plane and creates a bit of a halo. So there is sort of those types of light situations that I really quite like as well, when there's a little bit of glow to the light, a little bit of softness to the edges surrounding the light shape. Okay, so I'm going to move forward now to Claire Shea, who says, I'm an avid watcher of your painting time-lapse videos on YouTube. Thank you, Claire. And would you be able to tell us a bit about how you film these videos of your painting process? Specifically, how to film a vertical canvas, how to position the camera without hands blocking the canvas. Also, I learned so much just by watching your process. Would it be helpful to record one's own process and watch it back? Not necessarily to publish it, but to identify things to not to do. Thank you so much. That's interesting. I like that idea for sure. The only way to find out is to try. So why not? Set up a camera for yourself, and you can get like a little tripod, and they come with different attachments as well. There's even little attachments where you can attach the phone if you have that, unless you have a proper camera to film with. But I like that idea that you can record your own process and watch it. as a way to kind of synopsize. I mean, I haven't really seen that incorporated into training, but again, that does not mean that it won't work. I think that's a really, I think it's an interesting idea for sure. I wonder how that would affect the decisions that you would make as well if you'd be influenced by the camera being there. Yeah, I mean, it could be a litmus test. So why not? I would say go for it. Give it a try and test it out, and then you can kind of speed forward as well. Yeah, maybe it could be interesting there. So when I set up the filming process for my paintings, I'm right-handed, so I'll have the camera going in from the left, and this way I don't block the camera with my hand. Now, when I film, there is the camera is sort of off to the side a little bit. I can't do that. So it's off to the side a little bit on the one side, so it's kind of behind my shoulder and then angling over. So I'm not able to have it right in the view spot. So what I tend to do is that I will change slightly the perspective warp that happens when filming from an angle, and I use I used Final Cut Pro for that. Used to use iMovie, which is, you can't actually change the perspective. So Final Cut Pro. And so I do that for all of my painting processes right now, tutorials. And if you're just tuning into this live stream now and you're interested to find out more about what I do, you can find a lot of portrait painting tutorials on my Patreon page, which is patreon.com Cornelia Hernes Artwork, where you can actually see this portrait here. It's deep in the archives, but there is a lot of content to dig into. I also want to make sure to mention that today and today only there is a special discount code for the masterpiece demo that you will find here on Proko.com, and I think the coupon code is painting25, so make sure that you add painting25 in the coupon code if you haven't already purchased the masterpiece demo, where there's several ones, but if you see, my one I think is called Side Size Portrait with Side Size, and it's a portrait of a woman who has a blue background. Anyway, have a look. So now I'm going to maybe choose some other questions here. Brenda Sonneveld: to learn to draw and paint, what is the base? What should I focus on? Anatomy, perspective? Yeah. Anatomy is helpful. But we also don't need to go into all the kind of scientific Latin names in order to recognize anatomy. But you know, having some sense of the basic structure, let's say, of the portrait, like knowing a little bit like the eye socket and the zygomatic arch right here, and kind of having some familiarity with it, even if you're just looking at the skull and, you know, seeing what the foundation of kind of the underlying bone structure is, that can be actually really helpful for sure. And then perspective is something that is I think essential if you are working with more sort of multi-figure compositions, or figure in an interior, or working from your imagination as well. You don't necessarily need perspective as a concept so much when working with the portraiture. Yeah, as a concept, that is something that applies a little bit more to space, I think, and distance. Also, of course, with the exception that if you're working with like a figure that is dynamic and that you have foreshortening, etc., then of course having some perspective knowledge is helpful. But if it is kind of working with the basics of drawing and painting, then gesture and proportion, that's kind of the major pillars of structure, and working with shadow and light. That would be like the major components that come to my mind. So looking at the interaction between dark and light, and looking at the structure of the shadow shape as a way to create a internal structure. So when you look at Varvara right here, you see that she has a strong light shape and a strong shadow shape. So that shadow shape is very defined, and it kind of travels around the temple, and then the cheekbone, and it goes into the jaw, and then her chin, and then there's a cast shadow on her neck. And then we see a little bit of a shadow right below her nose. There's a little bit of shadow in the area of the eyes as well, but mostly there's an interaction between dark and light values there. And so setting up something or using a reference or setting up a composition that gives you a very clear distinction between shadow and light, that's a really helpful way to begin, because that will enable you to study the kind of concept of the shadow shape as a structure. And what makes the shadow shape so unique is that it has this sort of darker mass within the light shape of the portrait. It doesn't always have to be very large. It can be a small shadow shape, but we still need a little bit of shadow typically to kind of get a bit of tangible structure to hold on to. It's also favorable so that we can get a nice range of values to work from. So, so working with a shadow that has a nice design, and that gives you the opportunity to, for example, work with a shadow shape contour. One of the elements that's so intriguing about the shadow shape is that it essentially provides us with a contour in the interior of the form. So when we look at the cheek right here on her, that's the conclusion of a form. That's the contour of her. But the shadow shape also has a contour, but it's kind of exists within the form. It's a conclusion of a form, kind of being a linear design, but also has a connection to the dark transitional halftones that are collaborating with it. So working with the concept of the shadow shape and the light shape is really helpful as a starting point to looking at mass, line, rhythm, and also as a way to exercise kind of the relationships of these masses as a way to translate gesture and proportion. Yeah, so it's a big question, Sonnenfeld, because it's one of those things where you need a couple of key concepts, and then you just need to exercise and practice. So I do think that it's great to see you here on Proko. This is certainly a great resource for sort of key concepts of drawing, and that of course ties in with paint as well. And I think getting those key concepts so that you don't have to invent them yourself is really helpful. And then it's just kind of repetition. So gesture and proportion, shadow shape, light shape, looking at the distances between, such and such area of the portrait, if you're working with portrait or working with a figure. So that's the major thing that come to mind. Anatomy, I think, in addition, is good, but I don't necessarily think I would recommend to start like with an anatomy book if you don't have kind of prior feeling for drawing and painting. It's good to have a little bit of feel for the mediums that you're going to be working with, but of course, any knowledge is never a what do you call it, a bad thing. So if you're ready to kind of take on anatomy as a way to kind of strengthen your understanding of structure, then I think that's great. I know for myself, anatomy has kind of become a little bit secondary to just practicing the structure of sort of the visual manifestation of anatomy as I've kind of studied it over some decades now. All right, I hope that helped a little bit. Stephen Bauman, and that's my husband, he says, I love your work. What's it like being an absolute talent powerhouse in the world of painting? That is a slightly biased question, but that is very sweet. That is very cute. So thank you so much, Stephen, for saying something there. So I don't know what to answer. That question left me like mute. I don't know what to say. Painting is great and fun and very addictive. I'll just leave it at that. All right, so also remember to promote your one-day coupon code. It is 25% off your masterpiece demo on Proko using code painting25. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes remaining from this live stream. Let me just kind of have a couple of comments on my demo there, and then I want to go back into some of these questions because I want to answer as many of them as possible. Yeah, okay, I have to kind of speed through there. But let's have a glance at the demo for a moment. Now, going into the area of the features of the mouth, the area of the mouth tends to be a pretty complex area of the portrait, which is also why I tend to kind of cycle through towards it a bit. Certainly, this area has been worked on during this painting process as well. But you notice that there's sort of several cycles kind of in the painting process. You know, starting with larger blocks of information, then going into the features of the eyes and the nose and then the mouth. And then that cycle has kind of repeated itself sort of several times. And now kind of in concluding this portrait, I'm kind of revisiting the area of the mouth again. When working with the mouth, one of the reasons why it is a very complex area is because there's a lot of subtle values, planes, surrounding this particular form. We have, of course, the top and the bottom lip, and then we have the corners of the mouth. And then there is a lot of kind of flexibility, of course, just by how the mouth is constructed in terms of speaking and eating and moving, etc. So we have a lot of flexibility kind of designed, kind of embedded in the skin and the kind of movement around here. So one of the things that we can see is that there is a little bit of a kind of a micro fold, I want to say, that tends to occur kind of right here, where there's a kind of a curvature. It's very, very miniature, very minuscule. But that creates usually a very active, very dynamic sequence of values that connects the darkest kind of moments of the corner of the mouth into the surrounding light shape. And something similar is occurring also with the planes, kind of connecting the area above the top lip into the lip. There's also, it's not a sharp break there, it's actually a kind of rapid sequence of really small planes. And those planes are catching the light in different ways, and therefore we have actually very quick transition within a kind of compressed space, typically moving from the lip into the surrounding values. Working with those connections, so the connections of values that exist surrounding the mouth, is key to connecting the mouth to the surrounding light shape, or to the surrounding anatomy, to the chin and to the area above the lip. What often happens is that we psychologically recognize that the mouth is its own kind of body part, and it sort of has a connection between kind of what's the lip and what's the surrounding area. But if we look at this visually, we will instead see an interaction of dark and light values. So when you look at Varvara's, well, not even my painting, but also just the reference image there for a second, when you blur your eyes slightly, you see that the darkest note of the mouth is in the corner of the mouth, and then there's like a line separating the top and the bottom lip. There's a micro shadow hanging out right there. There's something similar happening, I think, on me actually, because the light is also kind of from a vertical direction, and through that there's a little bit of this micro shadow that is occurring and creating a linear separation between the top and the bottom lip. This is of course going to be affected by the direction of the light. But in the situation then we are seeing the darkest note of the mouth not being sort of outside, but kind of rather in the interior of the mouth. And then we see actually quite a bit of light that's being caught on the bottom lip, and then we see a slightly darker value right below the mouth. And this is again kind of showing the interaction between the planes transitioning away from the light, planes moving towards the light, planes transitioning away from the light. And so looking at those values as a way to create the structure of those planes are really important. And so when we then look at something like the mouth, not so much as psychologically recognizing that there is a contour to it, but looking at it as an interaction of dark and light, that is the way to translate it visually. And in addition, considering the kind of cornucopia of subtle transitional halftones that are connecting the mouth to the surrounding space, that is also a way to ensure that you're not creating kind of a floating mouth in your portrait. I think it's also especially meaningful to kind of again look at the connection between the darkest note of the corner of the mouth and then working with that kind of active transition of halftones that connect that area. In that moment of the portrait, there is also so much of the expression that comes to life. So even in this painting session, or the last moment of this painting process, you notice that the expression changed a little bit between being a little bit more serious, and now there's a little bit more of a settled smile in the portrait expressed due to the movement of the shape configuration that is occurring right there. Okay, so in terms of the eyes, I'm running out of time now, but I just want to mention too that with the eyes, that they also present a psychological focal point, and we tend to kind of be attracted to eyes already, especially when they're kind of glancing out towards us, kind of from the dimension of the painting. But even if they are a psychological focal point, they don't necessarily have to be jam-packed with sharp information everywhere. So when you're concluding your portrait, be selective where you add those darkest, crispest accents, and permit a lot of soft and settled transitions to prevail. So even looking at the connection between the iris and the white of the eye, that's a relatively soft connection in the situation, yet the structure is still here. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this demo, and before we wrap up, there's about 4 minutes remaining. I'm just going to see how many questions that I can answer here. Aaron Dandi Boina says, hello Cornelia, I love your work, thank you, and many of them have such a softness. I wonder if you could give any tips on handling pressure, especially in graphite. Yeah, so graphite, the trick there, I would say, is that, now I just have a pen here, I don't have graphite, but when you're working with your values in graphite, then make sure that you are not holding it like this when you're rendering your values, but you're holding your pencil a little bit more at the back right here, so that you're not adding a lot of pressure this way, the way that we are taught to write. But when you have your pencil here and you have your paper here, then having a relatively low degree of sort of angle between the graphite and the paper, you can kind of permit a bit more of a feather light touch between the application of graphite to the paper. So that would be how you can reduce the pressure between the graphite and the paper. And that way you can build from a sequence of lighter values into gradually going darker and darker and darker. So that would be kind of just a quick response to that. And then I think in terms of softness in the element of paint, I think concluding a lot of these edges with a sequence of soft connection, and for example by painting wet and wet, or even using a bit of a softening type brush to whisk away sort of sharper edges, that is the key element to creating a conclusion that is rich with softness and atmosphere. Okay, so we have 2 minutes remaining, might go a little bit over time here, but not too much. Povelesto, hey Cornelia, this is a wonderful talk demonstration so far. Thank you so much, glad you like it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I have 2 questions. Who do you pull inspiration in the fine art scene and why? Have you tried painting without blending, smudging? What was that experience like? That's a good question. Yeah, so who do you pull inspiration in the fine art scene? Well, I mean, Stephen Bauman, of course, who is my husband, and you know, we do, especially kind of living together in this year of complete isolation. It's just been the 2 of us. I really enjoy that so much, actually. I mean, he's the person I will talk to a lot about ideas, and he will share his ideas. So that's you know, it sounds like silly maybe to say it, but that's really the truth. We are so close, and also creatively, I think we fuel each other. And then I do also look at a lot of turn of the century artists, a little bit more so than contemporary artists, because I sometimes get a bit overwhelmed actually, in terms of everything that is kind of produced out there. There's a lot of fantastic artists out there today for sure. But you know, for that reason, I almost find that I get a little bit overwhelmed. I look at a lot of turn of the century artists. I'm going to turn off the window here now. So I just want to say bye to you all, and thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a joy to hang out here today for these couple of hours. And again, if you would like to hear more about my work or see more of my tutorials, then tune in to my Patreon page, which is patreon.com Cornelia Hernes Artwork. Okay, bye bye and take care. And I'm just going to